In the bruised hours between dusk and full dark, where the desert holds its breath and violence waits patient as stone, Jose Mal Langford found what his guilt had been searching for. He was drawing evening water from the well when he saw her, face down in the dust 20 yards out, one massive hand still reaching toward salvation she'd never make. A woman, taller than any he'd ever seen, her buckskin clothes soaked black with blood. She wore ceremonial beadwork that marked her as Apache. An arrow jutted from her side, broken off at the shaft. When he knelt beside her and turned her over, her eyes opened, black as rifle bores, burning with something between fury and calculation. He offered his canteen. She stared at him like she was memorizing every line of his face, every scar on his hands. Then she drank. Once, twice, 3 times. When she was done, she grabbed his wrist with crushing strength and spoke one word in accented English. Counted. Then she released him, rose to a full, towering height despite the arrow wound, and vanished into the gathering darkness without another sound. Jose watched the place where she disappeared until the stars came out, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was still watching when dawn broke and showed him what counted meant. Jose Mal Langford had lived on this land long enough to recognize the smell of reckoning in the air. The ranch sat in a narrow valley where the mesquite grew sparse, and the nearest living soul was 3 days' hard ride east. He'd chosen this isolation with purpose. No witnesses, no judgment, just cattle, a few horses, and the kind of silence that let a man pretend his ghosts had stopped following. He wasn't running from the law. The law had no jurisdiction over what he'd done at Black Mountain. He was running from himself, from the memory of smoke rising from Apache lodges while he stood frozen with a rifle in his hands, following orders he should have refused. That evening, after the Apache woman had vanished into the hills, Jose went about his work the same as always. He fed the horses, their nervous whinnying louder than usual. He checked the fence line where the posts had started to lean. He mended the gate that hung crooked on its hinges. But his hands shook. His mind kept circling back to her, the way she'd looked at him, not with fear or gratitude, but with assessment, like she'd been taking his measure and reaching some conclusion he wasn't privy to. The crushing grip on his wrist, that single word, counted. He told himself it didn't matter. Travelers passed through this territory all the time, prospectors, traders, Apache moving between encampments. She'd gotten hurt, gotten lost, and now she was gone. That was the end of it. He repeated this to himself as he latched the barn door, as he carried his rifle inside the cabin, as he barred the door and windows for the first time in months. But that night, lying on his cot in the suffocating darkness, Jose couldn't escape the certainty that had settled in his bones like winter cold. The horses were restless. He could hear them stamping and snorting in the corral, sensing something he couldn't see. Once the bay mare let out a high, terrified whinny that raised the hair on his neck. Jose sat up, listening. Nothing followed, just the wind pushing against the walls and the distant howl of something hunting in the hills. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling beams he'd hewn himself, trying to remember why he'd thought isolation would bring peace. Tomorrow he'd ride out to the north pasture and check on the herd. Tomorrow everything would return to normal. Tomorrow the woman with eyes like rifle bores would be nothing but a strange memory. He was still telling himself that when exhaustion finally pulled him under. He was wrong. Jose stepped outside at first light, suspenders hanging loose at his sides, squinting against the glare. The sky was that pale, merciless blue that promised another day of scorching heat. The valley stretched out before him, familiar scrubland and rocky outcroppings, the same view he'd woken to for 3 years. Except it wasn't the same. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Shadows on the ridgeline, maybe. Tricks of the early light. But shadows don't sit motionless on horseback, watching. Shadows don't hold rifles and lances. Shadows don't surround a man's ranch in perfect military precision and wait. José's blood turned to ice water. They were everywhere. On the northern ridge, lined up like dark sentinels against the dawn sky. On the eastern hills, positioned at regular intervals. On the western slope that ran down to the dry creek bed. On the southern rise where the trail led back to civilization. Everywhere he looked, there were more. Apache warriors on horseback, war paint visible even at this distance, weapons gleaming. He started counting, 50, 70, 100, then stopped because his hands were shaking too badly to keep track. 200, 300, 400 warriors, maybe more, forming a perfect circle around his ranch. Not advancing, not making war cries, not moving at all, just watching, waiting, judging. The horses in the corral were pressed against the far fence, heads high, eyes rolling white with terror. They could smell it, the presence of that many predators, that much controlled violence. José's cattle had scattered to the far corners of the pasture, lowing in distress. Even the birds had gone silent. José scanned the circle, trying to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't a raid. Raiders struck fast, burned what they wanted, took what they needed, and vanished like smoke. This was something else entirely. This was deliberate, organized. This was a message written in 400 armed warriors, and José had no idea what it said, only that his life depended on reading it correctly. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, leaning just inside the doorframe, then stopped. What good would one rifle do against an army? He stepped into the yard, boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, making himself visible, making himself vulnerable. The morning sun climbed higher, and still the warriors didn't move. They were carved from stone, born from the desert itself, patient as death. Then, as if summoned by José's racing thoughts, movement caught his eye. A single rider broke from the formation on the northern ridge and began descending the slope. Slow, controlled. The horse picked its way down the rocky incline with the precision of an animal that had been ridden through every kind of terrain imaginable. José didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle, didn't run. He just stood there in the center of his yard, watching the rider approach, wondering if this was the day his reckoning finally came due. The rider stopped 100 feet away. An older warrior, his face lined with decades of sun and wind and something harder, command. He wore no war paint, but he didn't need it. Authority radiated from him like heat from stone. Grey streaked his long hair. A scar ran from temple to jaw on the left side of his face. He carried a lance decorated with feathers and beadwork, and a rifle was strapped to his saddle. Behind him, more riders appeared, dozens of them, flanking, watching, waiting for orders that would come in silence. José swallowed hard. His throat was desert dry. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, broken only by the nervous stamping of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Then the old warrior raised one hand. Not in greeting, not in threat, just raised it, held it there, waiting for something José couldn't name, some response he didn't know how to give. José's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Whatever was about to happen had already been decided long before he woke up this morning. The question wasn't if he would survive. The question was why. Why had helping one wounded woman brought an entire army to his door? Why was he still breathing when 400 warriors could have killed him in his sleep? And then he understood. The woman's final word. Counted. They had been counting him, measuring him, and now the test was about to begin. José stepped outside at first light, suspenders hanging loose at his sides, squinting against the glare of another merciless dawn. The sky stretched pale blue and cloudless, promising heat that would crack the earth by noon. He moved toward the corral out of habit, his mind still fuzzy with the fragments of restless sleep, already reaching for the feed bucket. Then he froze. They were everywhere. On the northern ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun, warriors on horseback, perfectly spaced, perfectly still. On the eastern hills, more of them, positioned like chess pieces across the landscape. The western slope, the southern rise, every vantage point that overlooked, his ranch now bristled with mounted figures, not scattered or random, organized, deliberate, military precision that spoke of discipline and unified command. Jose's breath caught in his throat. He started counting. 50 warriors visible on the north ridge alone, 70, maybe 80 on the eastern hills. He counted 100 on the south, then 200, then stopped because his hands were shaking too badly to keep his place. 300, 400, maybe more hidden in the drawers and behind the rock formations. An army, a silent, watching army that had materialized overnight like a fever dream made flesh. They wore full war regalia. Even at this distance, he could see the paint on their faces, black and red and white in patterns he didn't understand but recognized as deliberately chosen. Feathered lances caught the morning light. Rifles rested across saddles, barrels gleaming. They sat their horses with the ease of men born in the saddle, and not one of them moved. They didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't advance. They simply watched, and that stillness was more terrifying than any war cry. Jose scanned desperately for an opening, some gap in the circle where a man on a fast horse might slip through. There was nothing. Every route out of the valley was blocked. He was surrounded as completely as a rabbit in a snare, and the hunters had all the time in the world. Behind him, his horses screamed. High, terrified sounds that raised the hair on his neck. They were pressed against the far side of the corral, bodies shaking, nostrils flared. They could smell it, hundreds of predators, the scent of violence held barely in check. His cattle had scattered to the farthest corners of the pasture, lowing in distress. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving only silence and the weight of 400 pairs of eyes. Then movement. A single rider broke from the northern ridge and began descending. Slow, measured. The horse picked its way down the rocky slope with practiced precision, and Jose's stomach turned to lead. The rider was older. Jose could see that much even from a distance. Face weathered like canyon stone, grey streaking his long hair. He wore no war paint, but carried himself with the bearing of absolute command. A lance rode in his hand, decorated with feathers and beadwork that marked status Jose couldn't read. A rifle was strapped to his saddle. Behind the old warrior, more riders appeared, flanking him in perfect formation. The demonstration was clear. This man commanded, and 400 warriors obeyed without question. The chief stopped 100 feet away. For a long moment, he simply studied Jose, black eyes measuring, calculating, rendering judgment on something Jose didn't understand. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he raised his lance and drove it into the earth. The shaft quivered, standing upright between them. Challenge and boundary both. Line drawn in dust and blood and history. Jose had no weapon, no chance, no hope of fighting or fleeing. He had only the choice he'd made last night when he'd given water to a dying woman instead of walking away. That decision hung between them now, waiting to be judged. The chief's eyes bored into him, measuring, deciding if Jose Mal Langford would see another sunset. Then the old warrior raised his hand, sharp, commanding gesture. On every ridge, warriors shifted position, moving closer, tightening the circle, the noose drawing closed around Jose's throat. The first day passed like walking through waist-deep water, every movement exhausting, every task taking twice as long under the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. José fed his horses with trembling hands, the grain spilling from the bucket. He repaired a section of fence, feeling the scrutiny like physical pressure against his spine. He drew water from the well, the rope slipping in his sweating palms. The warriors never moved. They sat their horses with inhuman stillness, and when José looked again hours later, different faces occupied the same positions. They were rotating shifts, he realized, sleeping in their saddles, eating without ever looking away. The circle never broke. Night brought no relief. Fires appeared on the ridges after dark, ringing his ranch in flickering light. He could see their silhouettes against the flames, still watching, still waiting. Day 2, he found a bundle at his door at dawn, wrapped in hide, tied with leather cord. Inside, strips of dried meat, heavily salted. A water skin, full. José stared at it, understanding crystallizing cold in his gut. They were feeding him, keeping him alive. This wasn't a siege meant to starve him out or burn him down. This was something else. A test. But of what, he had no idea. Day 3 arrived with the sun climbing toward its peak, heat shimmering off the rocks. José was mucking out the barn when he heard it, a ripple of movement on the eastern ridge. The line of warriors parted like water around stone, creating a gap in their formation. Through that gap, a single rider appeared. Even at a distance, José recognized her. The height, the bearing. But she'd been transformed. She wore ceremonial dress now, buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, turquoise and silver gleaming at her throat. War paint marked her face in patterns that made her look both ancient and timeless. The arrow wound that should have killed her showed no sign of weakness. She sat her painted horse with absolute confidence, moving down the slope with fluid grace that reminded José of a hunting cat. She was terrifying, she was magnificent, and she was riding straight toward him. Betty All Garcia dismounted 10 feet from where José stood frozen, and up close her presence was overwhelming. She stood nearly as tall as him, all coiled muscle and controlled violence. Her eyes, those black rifle-bore eyes, locked onto his with predatory focus. "You are counted, white man," she said. Her English was accented but clear, each word deliberate. José's mouth was dry as bone. "I don't understand." "You saved enemy. Why?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications José couldn't read. He chose truth because lies wouldn't save him now. "You were dying. That's all I saw." Betty studied him for a long moment, head tilted slightly like a bird examining prey. Then she spoke, and her words carried the weight of life and death. "My father, War Chief Mangus, gives you 8 days, 8 tests. You pass all, you live. You fail one, you die slow." "What tests?" José's voice cracked. "We watch. You show us who you are. Truth cannot hide 8 days." She moved closer, and José fought the instinct to step back. "That arrow wound was final trial of my warrior initiation. 3 days alone, no food, no water, no help. Prove I am strong enough to lead. Prove I am worthy." Understanding dawned bitter and cold. "I interrupted your ritual." "You saved my life," Betty corrected. "But you also broke sacred test. My father must know. Is this white man honorable, or is he enemy pretending kindness?" She circled him slowly, evaluating. "Most white men would let Apache woman die. Or worse. You did not. My father wants to know why." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the ceremonial scars on her arms, the paint that couldn't quite hide the intelligence burning in her eyes. "Are you different, white man? Or are you just clever?" Day 4 brought the drums. They started at sunset, low, rhythmic, relentless. A heartbeat that wasn't his own pounding through the darkness. Jose tried to sleep, but the sound followed him into his cabin, through the walls, into his skull. It never stopped, never varied, just that steady, maddening rhythm that made his teeth ache and his hands clench into fists. When he finally drifted off near dawn, he jerked awake minutes later, uncertain if the drumming was real or if it had burrowed so deep into his mind that silence was no longer possible. Day 5, the fires multiplied. As darkness fell, flames appeared on every ridge, every rise, every vantage point surrounding his ranch. A perfect circle of light that turned night into something else, something between dream and nightmare where shadows danced and the air itself felt thick with judgment. Jose stood in his doorway, watching the ring close tighter, and felt something breaking inside him. That night, sleep came in fragments. When it did, Black Mountain came with it. Apache lodges burning, the smell of smoke, and worse, children screaming, a woman running with an infant in her arms, the crack of rifles. Jose's own hands shaking but still pulling the trigger because the captain had given orders, and good soldiers followed orders, and... He woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the drums still pounding. Afternoon of day 5, his cabin door opened without warning. Betty stood in the threshold, backlit by harsh sunlight, and walked inside like she owned the place. She pulled out, the chair across from him at his rough-hewn table, and sat, saying nothing. Just studied him with those unblinking eyes while Jose's heart hammered against his ribs. "You have ghosts in your eyes," she said finally. "Old ghosts." Jose tried to keep his voice steady. "Everyone who lived through the war has ghosts. These ghosts have names, Apache names." The air left his lungs. She knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew. The walls seemed to close in, the drums outside growing louder, merging with the drumming of blood in his ears. "Black Mountain," Betty said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Jose's hands trembled on the table. He wanted to lie, wanted to deny, wanted to be anywhere but here, facing this woman whose people he'd helped slaughter. But he'd spent 3 years running from the truth, and it had caught him anyway. "I was there," he whispered. "I was following orders." The words sounded hollow even to him, the excuse of cowards and murderers throughout history. Betty's expression didn't change. No rage, no accusation, just that steady, measuring gaze. "My uncle died at Black Mountain, 2 cousins, 6 children from our band." She paused. "I was 12 winters. I heard the gunfire from where we camped 2 days north. We knew what the smoke meant." Jose waited for her to call the warriors, to end this test with the judgment he deserved. His throat closed around words that wouldn't come. Apology too small, explanation too pathetic, silence too cowardly. But Betty didn't move. "Past is dead," she said. "Past cannot be changed. What you do now is alive. What you choose today is truth." She stood, moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. "My father knows everything you did. That is why test is hard. That is why 8 days, not 3. If guilty man can change, that is power. If guilty man only hides, that is nothing." She left without waiting for response, and Jose sat alone in the gathering darkness, understanding finally crystallizing like ice in his chest. This wasn't just about mercy shown to a dying woman. This was about whether redemption was real or just another lie men told themselves, whether someone who'd burned Apache families could become someone who'd bleed to protect them, whether the distance between monster and man could actually be crossed, or if guilt was a brand that marked you forever. Outside, the drums continued. Inside, Jose's ghosts whispered their Apache names. Day 6 dawned quiet, the drums finally silent. Jose was at the well, drawing water for the horses, when the first gunshot cracked across the southern hills. Then another, a third. Multiple rifles, firing in sequence, the sound of men hunting, not fighting. The shots were getting closer. On the ridges the warriors moved for the first time in days. Whistles split the air, sharp, coded signals that rippled around the circle. Hand signs flashed in the sunlight. The entire formation shifted with fluid precision, warriors repositioning, without a single shouted command. Jose had never seen anything so organized, so disciplined. Betty materialized beside him like smoke taking shape. One moment he was alone, the next she was there, close enough to touch. "White men," she said. "Many, they hunt us." "How many?" Jose's grip tightened on the well rope. 20, maybe more. They have Apache scalps on their saddles. Her voice was flat, factual. "This is revenge party." She turned to face him fully, and the intensity in her eyes made his breath catch. "They will ask you where we are. What will you say?" Jose opened his mouth, but before he could form an answer, Betty was gone. Vanished like she'd never been there. On the ridges, the warriors melted backward into draws and behind rock formations. Within seconds, the valley looked empty. No sign that 400 men had been watching for 6 days straight. Only the tracks remained, and the cold fire pits, and evidence everywhere for anyone who knew how to read it. The thunder of hooves announced the posse before Jose saw them. They came hard down the southern trail, 20 riders, maybe more behind, armed with rifles and revolvers and the kind of righteous fury that made men dangerous. They rode like they owned the territory, like violence was their native language. The leader pulled up 30 yards from Jose's cabin, and recognition hit like a fist to the gut. Captain Hendricks, older now, face weathered to old leather, but those eyes were the same, cold and calculating and utterly certain of their own righteousness. Former Confederate irregular who'd made his reputation hunting Apache during the border wars. A man who knew Jose's face, knew his history, knew things Jose had spent 3 years trying to forget. "Well, well." Hendrick's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Jose Moll Lankford. Heard you crawled out here to die quiet." Jose kept his hands visible, his voice level. "Just trying to live quiet." "Live quiet." Hendrick spat into the dust, his gaze sweeping the ranch with the practiced eye of a hunter reading sign. "We're tracking hostiles. Big war party, maybe 300-400 Apache. Trail leads straight through this valley." His eyes locked back onto Jose. "You must have seen them. Where'd they go?" Jose's throat went dry. All around them, invisible on the ridges, 400 warriors waited, watching, listening. This was the test within the test, the moment where everything balanced on a razor's edge. Hendricks dismounted, boots hitting dirt with deliberate weight. He walked closer, studying Jose's face like he was reading a familiar book. "Funny thing," he said conversationally. "All these tracks, fire pits still warm, signs of hundreds of horses camped here for days." His smile sharpened. "You trying to tell me you didn't notice an army parked on your doorstep?" The other riders spread out, checking the corral, the barn, the fence lines, finding evidence everywhere, too much to deny, too obvious to explain away. Hendricks stopped 5 feet from Jose, close enough that his voice dropped to something almost intimate. "You and I, we got history, Lankford. Black Mountain. I remember you there. Remember what you did." He paused. "Remember what you couldn't do after." Jose said nothing. What defense existed? "So here's what I'm wondering." Hendricks continued. "Is this the same coward who puked behind the supply wagon, or is this something else entirely?" Jose forced himself to meet Hendricks' eyes. "I've seen signs. They moved through. North, I think." The smile that crossed Hendricks' face was colder than a January wind. You always were a bad liar, Langford, even at Black Mountain. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Around them, the other riders tensed, hands moving closer to weapons. Black Mountain was legend among border fighters, the kind of story men told in whispers, half proud, half ashamed. Hendricks walked closer, boots deliberate on the packed earth. I was there, right beside you. Saw you afterward, saw you vomiting behind the supply wagon while the bodies burned. Saw you crying like a woman. His voice carried just loud enough for the others to hear. I thought you were weak then, pathetic. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe you were just smart enough to feel guilty. Jose said nothing. What defense existed against the truth? Hendricks turned slowly, scanning the ridges with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades hunting humans. Those Apache are close, probably watching right now, and you know where. He turned back to Jose. Don't you? I don't. Hendricks studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. Search the place. Look for tracks, supplies, signals, anything that tells us where they went. The riders dismounted and spread out like wolves, rifles ready, checking the barn, the corral, the perimeter. Their boots kicked up dust as they moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this before. Raided ranches, hunted fugitives, tracked prey that didn't want to be found. Hendricks stayed close to Jose, close enough that his voice dropped to something almost gentle. You got one chance, Langford. One chance to make this right. Point us to their camp. Help us finish what we started at Black Mountain, and you're redeemed. You're a hero. You're one of us again. He paused. White men protecting white settlers from savages. That's how history remembers you. And if I don't? Jose's voice was barely above a whisper. Then you're the enemy. Hendricks' hand rested on his revolver. And we treat enemies appropriate. A young rider couldn't be more than 20, with the kind of enthusiasm that made Jose's stomach turn, called out from near the corral. Captain, fresh tracks everywhere, hundreds of horses. They've been camped here for days. Another voice from the barn. Fire pit still warm, supply caches hidden in the rocks. A third rider emerged from checking the fence line. Signs of organized encampment, military discipline. This wasn't a passing group. They were stationed here. Hendricks' expression shifted, the false gentleness dropping away like a mask. His face went dark, dangerous. You've been harboring them, feeding them, protecting them. He stepped so close Jose could smell tobacco and old sweat. An army of hostiles camped on your land for damn near a week, and you didn't ride to the nearest settlement? Didn't warn anyone? Didn't fire a single shot? Jose's throat tightened. Every lie he could think of crumbled before it reached his tongue. The evidence was everywhere. Tracks, fire pits, the trampled grass where hundreds of horses had stood watch. There was no explanation that would satisfy these men, no story that would make them lower their weapons and ride away. You're one of them now, Hendricks said quietly. That's what this is. You've gone native, turned traitor. His hand closed around his revolver grip. You know what we do to traitors, Langford. Around them, the other riders moved closer, forming a semicircle. Weapons drawn. Faces hard with the kind of certainty that made atrocities possible. And somewhere on the ridges, invisible and silent, 400 warriors watched to see what Jose Mal Langford would do when his moment of truth arrived. Hendricks raised his hand. 2 riders moved immediately, grabbing Jose by the shoulders and forcing him to his knees in the dirt. The impact sent pain shooting through his joints, but he kept his jaw clenched, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him wince. We can do this easy or hard, Hendricks said, looking down at him with the expression of a man discussing the weather. Your choice. There's nothing to tell. Hendricks nodded once. 2 more riders came forward with rope, jerking José's arms behind him and binding his wrists to the lower rail of the corral fence. The position forced him to lean forward awkwardly, unable to protect himself, unable to escape. His shoulders screamed in protest. What followed was methodical, professional. These men knew how to extract information, knew exactly how much pain a body could endure before breaking. Fists crashed into his ribs, his kidneys, his face. A rifle butt caught him in the temple, and the world exploded into white light. Boots connected with his spine. Someone grabbed his hair and slammed his head forward against the fence post. "Where are they camped?" José spat blood into the dust. Another blow. Ribs cracked with a sound like green wood snapping. "How many warriors?" Vision blurred. The world tilted sideways. "What's their plan? When are they attacking?" José's mouth filled with copper. Blood ran from his nose, his split lip dripped from his chin into the thirsty earth. But he stayed silent. Each question met with nothing but ragged breathing and the sound of impact. Finally, Hendricks raised his hand and the beating stopped. José hung against the fence, barely conscious, every breath a knife through broken ribs. Hendricks crouched down, so they were eye level. "You're protecting them. Why?" His voice carried genuine curiosity now. "What do you owe the Apache?" José worked his broken mouth, tasting blood and dirt. "I owe everyone the truth." He forced the words through shattered teeth. "Truth is, I don't know where they are." It wasn't quite a lie. The warriors had vanished like smoke. José genuinely didn't know their current position, couldn't have pointed to their camp even if he wanted to betray them. Hendricks studied his face, reading the truth of it, and something shifted in his expression. "You're dying for them, for the same savages who killed your own people." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "The same ones who've been raiding settlements, burning farms, taking scalps." José raised his head, blood streaming down his face. "My own people." He gasped. "Burned children at Black Mountain." Each word was agony. What does own people even mean? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses had gone still, sensing the shift in the air. Hendricks' face twisted with something beyond rage, something closer to betrayal. "You've chosen your side. So be it." He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade catching sunlight. "We'll get the information. Just takes time. Just takes the right motivation." He walked toward José with deliberate steps, knife raised, and José understood this was how it ended. Not in glory or redemption, but tied to a fence post in the dirt, dying for people whose language he didn't speak, whose God he didn't worship, whose trust he'd barely begun to earn. Hendricks was 3 feet away when the war cries split the air, high, ululating, terrifying. The sound crashed down from every direction at once. Hendricks froze, head snapping up. The other riders spun, weapons coming up, horses rearing in panic. On every ridge, every rise, every vantage point surrounding the ranch, Apache warriors appeared as if materialized from the earth itself. 400 strong, painted for war, rifles raised, forming a perfect circle of death. They'd been there all along, invisible, waiting, watching José bleed for them. Hendricks turned slowly, taking it in, the impossibility of escape, the certainty of massacre if they fought. His face went the color of old ash. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered. José, still bound to the fence, blood running into his eyes, almost smiled. Hendricks had finally seen what José had been seeing for 6 days. And now the captain understood exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Hendricks' posse scrambled for weapons, hands shaking as they brought rifles to shoulders. Horses wheeled in panic, eyes rolling white, sensing the predators that surrounded them. Men shouted contradictory orders, voices cracking with fear that no amount of bravado could hide. But the warriors didn't attack. They waited. 400 rifles raised in perfect unison, aimed down from elevated ground, and not one finger moved toward a trigger. Discipline was absolute, terrifying in its control. They were waiting for a signal, waiting for their chief's command, and that restraint was somehow more frightening than any charge would have been. Hendrik's eyes swept the ridges, doing the mathematics that every man there already knew. 20 riders on flat ground versus 400 warriors holding the high positions. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting for permission to begin. He pulled a knife and cut José's bindings with 2 savage strokes. "Get up!" His voice was tight, controlled. "You're going to walk us out of here." José staggered to his feet, every movement agony through broken ribs. Blood still dripped from his face, turning the dust beneath him to mud. "They'll let you leave. Just go." Hendricks grabbed José's shirt, jerked him close. "Use your friendship. Tell them to let us pass." He pressed his revolver to José's temple, the barrel still hot from being drawn. "Or I kill you right here and take my chances." José looked past him to the ridges, found Betty on the eastern rise, mounted on her painted horse, war paint marking her face in patterns of judgment. This was it, the 8th test, the final measure of who José Mal Langford truly was. Not who he'd been at Black Mountain, not who he'd tried to become in 3 years of hiding, but who he chose to be in this moment with a gun to his head, and everyone watching. "Tell them." Hendrik's finger tightened on the trigger. José could do it, could broker peace, use whatever goodwill he'd earned to let these men ride away. Save his own life in the process. It would be the smart choice, the practical choice, the choice that kept everyone alive today. But Hendricks would return, with more men, more guns, more determination. Would hunt these warriors until he'd collected enough scalps to satisfy his definition of justice. Would turn this valley into a killing ground, and all because José had chosen survival over principle. José spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. The posse, the warriors, the woman on the ridge whose life he'd saved. "I already burned. This is what rises from ash." He turned his head, looked Hendricks directly in the eye despite the gun pressed to his skull. "I can't help you. Won't help you. You want to kill me? Do it." For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Hendricks' finger white on the trigger, José's blood dripping steady into dust. 400 warriors waiting with the patience of men who'd learned to measure time in seasons rather than seconds. Then on the north ridge, War Chief Mangas raised his lance. High, deliberate, unmistakable command. 400 warriors began to advance, not rushing, not charging, moving with synchronized precision down the slopes, rifles still raised, closing the circle with the inevitability of a noose tightening. Slow, inexorable, terrifying in their discipline. Hendricks' face went grey. He lowered the gun, understanding finally breaking through rage. They weren't. Bluffing. They would die to protect this man who'd bled rather than betray them. "You're dead to us, Langford." Hendricks shoved José away, already moving toward his horse. "Every white settlement from here to El Paso will know you're a traitor. You'll be hunted like an animal." José wiped blood from his eyes. "Then I'll die a traitor, better than living a coward." Hendricks swung into his saddle, wheeled his horse south. "Mount up, now!" The posse fled at full gallop, dust rising behind them like smoke from funeral pyres, leaving threats and curses hanging in the air where 20 men had stood moments before. José watched them go, still standing somehow despite everything broken inside him. On the ridges, the warriors stopped their advance, waited, and slowly, deliberately, began to descend toward the man who'd chosen to burn twice rather than betray them once. The warriors descended in silence after the dust from Hendricks' retreat settled. Jose tried to remain standing, tried to meet them with whatever dignity a broken man could muster, but his legs gave out. He collapsed into the dirt, barely conscious, tasting blood and dust and the copper tang of his own failure to stay upright. Betty reached him first. She dismounted in one fluid motion and knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly gentle as they examined his wounds. Fingers probed his ribs. He gasped at the pain, checked the gash above his eye, tilted his head to assess the damage. "You are stronger than you look," she said quietly. War Chief Mangas approached with a group of elder warriors, their faces painted but their weapons lowered. They lifted Jose between them with the careful efficiency of men who'd carried wounded from battlefields, and the strange intimacy of it struck him. Former enemies tending his broken body, carrying him into his own cabin like they owned not just the land, but the right to show him mercy. They laid him on his cot. Someone brought water. Another produced strips of cloth for bandages. Mangas stood at the foot of the bed, studying Jose with those black, measuring eyes, and began to speak in Apache, the language flowing like water over stone, ancient and deliberate. Betty translated, her voice steady. "My father says, 8 days. 8 tests." Mangas counted on his fingers as he spoke, and Betty rendered each test into English. Test 1. Alone with dying woman, you chose mercy. Test 2. Surrounded by enemies, you did not flee. Test 3. Given supplies, you did not hoard. Test 4. Shown our pain, you listened. Test 5. Asked your past, you spoke truth. Test 6. White men arrived, you did not betray location. Test 7. Tortured for information, you did not break. Test 8. Gun to your head. Choice between life and honor, you chose honor. The chief's voice dropped lower, weighted with significance. 8 tests. Betty translated. You pass all. This is rare thing. Maybe only thing that matters. Mangas reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a medicine bundle, intricately beaded in patterns Jose didn't understand, filled with herbs that released sharp, clean scents when exposed to air. A small stone, polished smooth, nested in the center. The beadwork matched the pattern on Mangas's own ceremonial dress. Family colors, Jose realized. Bloodline markers. The chief began a ceremony. He burned sage, the smoke curling through the cabin, and chanted prayers in words that predated any map that called this territory something other than Apache land. Then he stepped forward and placed the medicine bundle around Jose's neck, the beadwork settling against his chest still sticky with blood. Betty's voice was soft but clear. This marks you protected kin. Any Apache sees this, knows you are brother. You cannot be harmed. You cannot be stolen from. You are family. Jose's hands trembled as they touched the bundle. I don't deserve this. Mangas spoke, and Betty translated with something that might have been approval in her eyes. My father says, that is why you deserve it. Man who thinks he deserves honor usually does not. Man who thinks he does not deserve it, maybe he understands what honor costs. Betty added her own words, not translating now but speaking truth she needed him to understand. But there is price. White men will see betrayal. They will hunt you, try to kill you. You cannot live in their world and wear this. You must choose. Jose's fingers closed around the medicine bundle, feeling the weight of it. Not just beads and herbs and stone, but everything it represented. Protection and exile. Brotherhood and banishment. Honor purchased with everything familiar. He met Mangas's eyes, then Betty's, and nodded once. Acceptance. The choice already made when he'd refused to betray them with Hendrik's gun pressed to his skull. 3 weeks later, Jose worked his land alone. The medicine bundle hung visible on his chest, beadwork catching sunlight as he repaired fence posts and tended cattle that had grown fat on autumn grass. The ranch was peaceful in ways it had never been before. No drums at night, no eyes watching from the ridges, just wind and sky and the honest labor of a man trying to earn what he'd been given. But he was completely isolated. The nearest trading post was 2 days' ride, and he couldn't go there. Word had spread. Hendricks had made sure of that. Any white settlement would see the Apache beadwork and know what it meant. Traitor, turncoat, target. His supplies were running low. Winter approached with the certainty of judgment, and Jose had flour for maybe 2 more weeks, salt for less. The cattle would survive on sparse winter grass, but he might not. Evening came early now, the sun dropping fast toward distant mesas. Jose was drawing water from the well when he saw the rider on the western ridge. He recognized her silhouette immediately. The height, the bearing, the way she sat her horse like she and the animal were one creature. Betty descended with a pack horse in tow, loaded heavy with supplies. She rode straight to him, no hesitation, and dismounted with buffalo meat and cornmeal and wool blankets spilling from the packs. "Hendricks spreads word," she said without preamble. "You have price on head, $500. Jose almost laughed, the sound rough in his throat. "That's more than I'm worth." Something flickered in Betty's expression, not quite a smile, but close. "My father sent supplies," and warning. 3 more pauses forming. "They will come." Was it worth it? Jose asked quietly. "What I chose." Betty dismounted fully, stepped close, and stood before him, warrior to warrior, equal to equal. "You saved my life. Now I save yours. We are balanced." She paused, placed her hand over the medicine bundle on his chest. "But more than that, you are brother now. When you are in danger, we will know. We will come. I'm not asking for that. You do not need to ask. That is what family means." She turned to mount her horse, then looked back, and in the fading light her face held something Jose had never seen there before. Not judgment, not calculation, but something gentler. Recognition, maybe. Respect. "My father says, guilty man who stays guilty is dead inside. Guilty man who changes is alive again." Her voice carried across the distance between them. "You are alive, Jose Mal Lankford." She rode into the sunset, her silhouette stark against the red sky, and Jose watched until she disappeared into the gathering darkness. His hand moved to the medicine bundle, fingers tracing the beadwork that marked him as protected, as family, as forever changed. For the first time since Black Mountain, the ghosts were quiet. Jose turned back to his well and drew up another bucket of water. The sun balanced on the edge of the world, painting everything gold and crimson. He poured water into the trough for his horses, watching it splash and settle, clear and cold and honest. The medicine bundle gleamed on his chest, visible, unmistakable, the choice he'd made rendered permanent in beads and leather and sacred herbs. He was alone, marked, hunted. Any white man who found him would try to collect that bounty. Any posse that rode through would see him as enemy. But his hands were steady as they worked the rope. His conscience was clear as the water that flowed from his well. And when he lay down that night, he would sleep without nightmares for the first time in 3 years. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is choose not to fight. But sometimes the bravest thing is choosing which fight is worth dying for. Jose Mal Lankford had made his choice. And whatever came next, pauses or peace, exile or execution, he would face it as the man he'd become, not the man he'd been. The sun set. The stars emerged. And in a valley between the ridges, a man who'd burned at Black Mountain finally rose from the ash.